So I absolutely love this poem, Rooms by Charlotte Mew. I didn't really know her that well. I'd heard of her before, but not really read much of her poetry. And after teaching this poem a little bit, I got really excited and I started reading more of her stuff because I decided she's awesome. So yeah, really good poet, would recommend her. Quite an ambiguous title, Rooms, but also quite specific. Just as a kind of fun starter to this lesson, I want you to just pause before we look at her poem and think about what this word means to you. You might do a little mind map on that word and just think about the connotations that come up. What does it make you think of when you hear the word rooms? What kinds of rooms do you picture? And then I want you to take 3 of those rooms that you're imagining. They can be any rooms that you've ever visited in your life, whether you've lived there or whether you've just been there once. And I want you to just describe them using poetic language. If you're confident or you enjoy writing poetry, try and turn that into a little bit of a poem. But if you're not that confident, you don't have to turn it into a poem. You can just use some descriptive language and just try and imagine those rooms in detail and use vocabulary that reflects the detail of those rooms. So this exercise should take you maybe around 10 minutes maximum, 10, 15 minutes. You can come back to it and expand it if you really like a poem afterwards. So yeah, when you're ready, we'll jump into the poem itself. You can also do that exercise after the lesson if you prefer to, but it is kind of interesting to do it first because you do it before you actually see her version of her own poem that she did in this way. There's not that much vocab, but there's a couple of things. Geneva is a place I've always wanted to visit, actually. It's a city in Switzerland set on Lake Geneva. Maddening means driving someone to madness, ceaseless, without stopping. And then we have this little poem, which I think is really beautiful. I'm going to read it aloud for you. I sometimes read them aloud and sometimes tell you to read them. So if you prefer to read the poems aloud yourself, you can also read them after mine or instead of listening to me read it. I remember rooms that have had their part in the steady slowing down of the heart, the room in Paris, the room at Geneva, the little damp room with the seaweed smell, and that ceaseless maddening sound of the tide, rooms where for good or for ill things died. But there is the room where we two lie dead, though every morning we seem to wake, and might just as well seem to sleep again. As we shall somewhere in the other quieter, dustier bed, out there in the sun, in the rain. So yeah, really stunning poem, I think. So beautiful, quite complex. So it starts kind of obvious and easy. She's remembering these rooms that have had their part in her life. They've played a role in her life at some point, especially in the slowing down of the heart. So you could interpret that as kind of aging. You could interpret that as like her kind of getting more mature and less kind of excitable and childish. Maybe there's like, formative experiences in these rooms. The room in Paris, the room at Geneva, and the little damp room with the seaweed smell. So there's 3 rooms. 2 of them are not described at all apart from the location. The third one is described in more detail using imagery. The little damp room, tactile image, with the seaweed smell, olfactory image, and that ceaseless maddening sound of the tide, auditory image. So 3 different types of imagery there to describe this one damp little room. And it kind of sounds like not that nice of a room. It's got a maddening sound of the tide. It's got seaweed smell, which could be good, but in this case, not so good. Damp is also not so good. And then whether for good or ill, whether for, a good reason or a bad reason, things died. Then it shifts to thinking about death and thinking about future rooms, the rooms where we two lie dead, though every morning we seem to wake and might as just as well seem to sleep again. As we shall somewhere in the other quieter, dustier bed, out there in the sun, in the rain. So the final couplet, these 2 lines here are talking about the final room that people inhabit, I suppose, which is the coffin or the tomb. The dustier bed. Dust is a reference to a biblical phrase that talks about humans basically being made of dust. So there's all these different rooms that we go through in our lives, and we have all these different memories that we connect to them. And eventually we end up in just one room that is quiet and dusty, which is the coffin or the tomb. It's a bit dark at the end. It's kind of a bit dark in the middle. Hopefully with your rooms, you had some happier memories in them than this one. But I think it's beautiful, and it's very interesting, and it's very nicely fluid in the way that memory is fluid. So if you want a bit more of an explanation of the story, there's one here that you can kind of just pause and read through. And we're going to just jump more into the analysis of it now. So it's nostalgic, and she's remembering rooms, the speaker, that has had an impact upon her. We imagine that the speaker is Mew herself, and these are rooms that she genuinely remembers. She had a family home in Bloomsbury, which is actually probably my favourite area of London. It's amazing, so go there if you ever visit London. It's a really famous place where lots of writers and artists live over time. One of my dreams one day is to have a house in Bloomsbury. They're very expensive nowadays, but I might get there eventually. At this time, though, they were cheap, and her family were... I don't know if they were cheap, actually, but they were kind of like anyone could sort of afford them. But in Mew's life, as we'll see later when we go into the context, she kind of had to move out of this room, and she actually had to relocate a lot throughout her life, and there's kind of periods of her life that she ties to places she lived because she moved around a lot. So language techniques, we've looked at imagery, a little bit of sibilance, steady slowing down of the heart. There's a biblical allusion to dust, the sort of saying here, what that means, the dustier bed. Also antithesis for good or ill, the sun, the rain. There's these kind of, diametrically opposed positive and negatives in the poem. Structurally, what's interesting is it's a single stanza, and the word stanza actually means room in Italian. So if you write poetry, I've been on quite a lot of poetry writing courses, and they always tell you to think of the stanza as a room. It's like a space in which your poem kind of inhabits. And if you have multiple stanzas, they're separate rooms in the house of your poem, if you think of it that way. She keeps all of the descriptions of the different rooms within a single stanza. And some of them are more developed as memories. Some of them are very quickly referenced, almost as if the poem is for herself. We don't know what happened in Paris or in Geneva. She's referencing it kind of for herself in that way. There's also a volta with the word but. Usually in poems, if you see the word but, it will actually be a volta, a turning point in the mood or tone of the poem. And then it looks, not back at the rooms that she's been in, but the future of her, which is death, and then her final quiet resting place. There's also a lot of irregularity to the line length, even the line position you might notice, and the rhyme scheme. So you can think a bit more deeply about why is it irregular? What is she doing there? So context for her, very interesting. Her Wikipedia page actually is super detailed. I remember reading it for like maybe at least an hour or something when I was kind of trying to learn more about her. Read more about her if you find her interesting. This poem is kind of sad, so it depends. I quite like sad poetry. I don't only like sad poetry, I like all emotions in poetry. But I find sad poetry interesting and kind of useful in some way to sort of reflect your own experiences against the experiences of the poet. It's kind of comforting, a bit like how sad songs can be comforting or that kind of thing. So some people really can't tolerate sad poetry and some enjoy it or kind of find it interesting. So it depends on your taste. She's quite a tragic person. So, her poetry reflects her kind of tragic circumstances and her tragic life. So her father died while she was quite young, and they had to give up their house in Bloomsbury, which is very sad because Bloomsbury is amazing. And then they moved. A lot of her siblings also died, and also 2 of her siblings were committed to mental hospitals. So there's a lot of kind of mental illness and sort of difficulty and suffering and death in her family. And what I found kind of strange but interesting about her is that she and her sister sort of entered into a pact where they decided they were never going to have families, never get married, never have children. They lived together. And so instead of, in some ways it's really sad because she never got to have a family or fall in love or anything like that. But in another way, it's quite amazing because she sort of poured all her energy and effort into creativity and poetry, which I think is quite beautiful. And sadly committed suicide after her sister died because she didn't really know what to do at that point. So very, very sad. Very sad lady. Tragic life, but I think very interesting, beautiful poetry. There's a lot of nice criticism of her where people actually really regard her very highly. So I think in her lifetime she wasn't really considered super amazing poet or very well studied or respected poet, but over time people have come to appreciate her more. And this is a nice little sort of quotation by Humbert Wolff about her, so you can kind of have a look at that. It talks about her poetry being unpretentious, being in touch with the source of poetry, being a mistress of her instrument, meaning she's really, really good at crafting poetry. Being austere, which I would agree with. The poetry is quite serious and stern, and it has depth and stillness to it, which I think is quite beautiful as well. So some interesting attitudes here. Death is kind of like sleep. That's quite a common one you see in literature. Memory is tied to location and situation. So we have these, especially if you've ever moved around in your life or lived in different places, which most people I think have. You have a set of memories. Those memories are tied to a location. And if those memories are domestic, they're tied to the space that you lived in for however long. So it's sort of like as soon as you move, you have these new periods and new different kind of like a new set of memories and experiences with every time you relocate. I've moved around loads in my life because I quite like living in different places and experiencing different things, and I'm kind of restless. So I lived in cities for quite a while, but different ones. And then I was like, maybe I should go live a nice quiet life in the country. So I moved to the countryside for 5 years, and then I was really restless and bored. So I moved back to a city. So at one point I moved to Italy, and I lived in Italy. So if I think of the places I've lived, they all have very specific memories and feelings attached to them, and no place is the same. Since I moved back to the city where my family are from, which is Sheffield, I've actually moved house twice as well. I bought a house, renovated the house, and then bought a new one. So even living in 2 places in the same city can give you quite a different experience of that city and a different kind of feeling there. So you might want to write down a few of the different places you've lived, especially if you've lived in more than 2 places in your life, and think about the memory attached to each one and the feeling, and if there's any difference in feeling, if you preferred some to the others. I remember the first time I moved, I was 10, and I loved my house, and my parents sold it, and they bought this new house that was bigger, and it had a bigger garden, and I hated it because it wasn't my old house that I loved, and I remember being so sad. So you might have kind of specific memories if your parents moved at some point or something like that as well. So the final attitude, the aging process kind of slows us down. We become reflective. So it feels like she wrote this poem sort of later on in life, where she's looking back over different moments in her life, different significant periods. Some of these I think I was reading might have been trips. I don't think she ever lived in Geneva. I'm not sure about Paris. So sometimes the rooms she's talking about are actually trips rather than places she lived, her entire life. So you can think of that as well. Like, is it a trip or is it a permanent place that she's living, or that if you're exploring your own ideas, you might look at times you're on holiday and stuff like that. So when you're ready, you can pick 2 themes and make little mind maps on them using quotations for the themes and then analysis for the quotations. And you can have a go at these essay questions. I recommend planning maybe 2 or 3 of them and then trying to write one full essay on the poem. If you feel like you still don't understand her, because she is quite complex, this one, I recommend just kind of studying her a bit more, maybe watch a video about her life or read a few more of her poems just to get a more in-depth understanding of her. So as a summary, she's quite sort of tragic in her tone, but she's exploring memory and the way that we connect emotion, memory, and space together. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Hope you like this poem and it's not too sad. And go to the scribbly.com website if you need any more help with lessons or you want to download documents, that kind of thing. So yeah, thank you, and I'll see you guys soon.